In a suburb where life seemed calm and perfect, Sebastian Lane, a successful and influential businessman, had always been meticulous and organized. His business trips were routine, and his family was accustomed to his strict itinerary. Every time he prepared for a trip, Eleonora, his wife, could anticipate every detail of his schedule and predict his every move. However, this time, something went wrong. The day Sebastian was supposed to return, he did not check in as usual. At first, Eleonora assumed that some urgent work matter simply required all his attention. These things happened occasionally, but after 24 hours without hearing from him, her concern began to grow. By the third day, Eleonora's patience had worn thin. She decided to call Sebastian's office, but to her astonishment, no one there knew anything about a recent trip. Associates and colleagues were baffled by the lack of contact with him. Though she initially tried to find logical explanations, perhaps he had simply forgotten to inform her. Or at worst, there had been an accident. She found more and more details that didn't add up. Finally, she decided to contact the police. A few hours later, officers arrived at her house. They inspected every corner and piece of furniture meticulously, looking for any clues that might explain Sebastian's disappearance. The house was immaculate, as if frozen in time. The dining table was perfectly set, and a faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee still lingered in the air. There were no signs of disruption or struggle. Everything was in its place. Even Sebastian's car was still parked in the driveway, with his keys resting in the bowl on the kitchen counter. The door had been locked from the inside, with no signs that anyone had forced entry or left in a hurry. The officers began asking questions. Did Sebastian have enemies? Could someone have wanted to harm him? However, Eleonora had no clear answers. The backyard was as orderly as the inside of the house. The garden, which Sebastian personally cared for, was in pristine condition, and his favorite chair on the porch was still perfectly placed, as if waiting for his return. The police continued to search every corner, from the garage to the attic, but they found nothing that provided clues about what had happened. Sebastian did not answer calls or messages. When attempting to track his phone, the police discovered that the signal had been lost the day he was supposedly set to leave for his trip. They reviewed his bank account but found no recent activity, no withdrawals, no transfers. In search of more clues, the investigators checked the security cameras around the house. The last footage of Sebastian showed him leaving the night before his disappearance. He wore his usual suit and appeared calm. This was the last time anyone saw him. Not knowing what to think, Eleonora clung to the hope that her husband had simply left for some reason and would return soon. However, with each passing day, that hope faded, replaced by a growing sense of fear. The police began to consider two possibilities. Either Sebastian had left voluntarily, or something darker had occurred. Both options were devastating for Eleonora. As her anxiety grew with each day without answers, the officers began to focus on details that had initially seemed insignificant. The fact that Sebastian's phone had been off since the day of his supposed departure was a disturbing enigma. The officers started to examine Sebastian's bank accounts in the days before his disappearance. There were no transactions, withdrawals, purchases, or even small expenses like gas or food. This was unusual for a man who managed large sums of money and led an active business life, suggesting that Sebastian may have disappeared deliberately, leaving as few traces as possible. This possibility led the police to consider the idea that Sebastian had voluntarily abandoned his family. Such cases were not unheard of. Sometimes, successful people decided to leave everything behind and start a new life. From the beginning, Eleonora appeared genuinely concerned, but her reaction to her husband's disappearance raised doubts among the detectives. Her tears and worry seemed real, but there were nuances that didn't quite fit in the eyes of the experienced officers. They noticed a certain tension when Eleonora spoke about the weeks leading up to Sebastian's disappearance. She claimed there had been no serious issues in their marriage, but her measured expressions and reluctance to provide details led the police to suspect that something was amiss. Neighbors interviewed during the investigation confirmed that the Lane home had always seemed harmonious, but a close family friend, who wished to remain anonymous, mentioned that things were far from perfect behind closed doors. This friend recalled that Sebastian seemed tired and withdrawn in the months before his disappearance, which could have indicated deep personal issues. The police began to consider the possibility that Sebastian might have taken his own life. This theory made sense given his sudden disappearance, the lack of communication, and the inactivity in his financial accounts. However, the absence of a body or any signs of violence complicated the situation. Eleonora provided the police with Sebastian's journals and access to his computer, but nothing indicated an intention to commit suicide. Even so, the officers couldn't ignore her strange behavior. Her pain seemed genuine, but something lay hidden beneath the surface. Eleonora repeatedly said she couldn't understand why Sebastian had left, but she avoided questions about the state of their marriage. Meanwhile, other details began to emerge. Detectives discovered that Sebastian had been spending more time away from home lately. Initially, this was attributed to his work, but now suspicions were growing. Sebastian's closest colleagues stated that he had been deeply focused on his work and hadn't shared any personal problems. However, his secretary mentioned that Sebastian had begun to avoid conversations about his family, something unusual for him. When the investigation reached a dead end, the theory that Sebastian might have left his family or taken his own life remained on the table, but there was no solid evidence. The investigators continued delving into Sebastian's personal life in hopes of uncovering clues that might shed light on his sudden disappearance. One of the first suspects was the housekeeper, Leisha Harper. From the start, her behavior caught the investigators' attention. Nervous gestures, avoidance of eye contact, and hesitation when answering simple questions. When detectives began questioning her, Leisha appeared nervous, constantly trying to change the subject and avoiding direct questions about the last day she had seen Sebastian. Since Sebastian's disappearance, Leisha's behavior had changed. The police noticed she had become more withdrawn and anxious, which could have been merely a reaction to the stressful situation, but her strange behavior during the interrogation couldn't be ignored. She stumbled over her answers, especially when asked about her activities on the day of Sebastian's disappearance. Eleonora, who initially trusted Leisha, began to have doubts about her honesty. She mentioned that she often left Leisha alone in the house while Sebastian was at work. In retrospect, this seemed strange. Before her husband disappeared, she didn't think much of it, but now her anxiety grew. What unsettled her even more was that Leisha had begun avoiding eye contact, something she hadn't done before during their conversations while cleaning or cooking. Since Sebastian's disappearance, the housekeeper kept her answers brief and steered away from any discussion about the family. During a search of the house, detectives found Sebastian's phone, which had been locked. However, after some expert work, they managed to recover several deleted messages. These messages drastically altered the course of the investigation, hinting at a romantic exchange with a woman whose initials matched Leisha's. Although the messages didn't reveal the whole truth, they were enough to suggest that Sebastian might have had a personal relationship with the housekeeper. The tone of the messages was clearly intimate, hinting at secret meetings and shared plans. The police were cautious and didn't rush to accuse Leisha directly. However, her behavior continued to raise suspicions that she was clearly hiding something. When asked if she had a special relationship with Sebastian, Leisha nervously denied it, but the investigators noticed her trembling voice and darting eyes. This only increased the police's suspicions, although there was still no direct evidence linking her to the disappearance. Eleonora began questioning more and more what had really been happening between her husband and this woman. With each passing day, her trust in Leisha eroded, and she could no longer believe in the loyalty of the woman who had been part of her family for so long. Eleonora started observing Leisha more closely. Every move, every word now seemed suspicious. However, the evidence remained vague. Leisha had become more careful in her actions, avoiding unnecessary interactions with the family, appearing less in public, and when the police arrived, making an effort to stay out of sight. As the police began investigating her past, they discovered that Leisha had faced financial difficulties before being hired by the Lane family, fueling suspicions that she might have been looking to take advantage of her relationship with Sebastian. The growing suspicions surrounding Leisha raised the question of whether she had not only been Sebastian's lover, but also been involved in his disappearance. The police continued to dig into Sebastian Lane's life, hoping to find the reasons behind his disappearance, and soon discovered several alarming facts that changed the direction of the investigation. Financial documents revealed that Sebastian's successful business was not as transparent as it appeared on the surface. The companies he managed were involved in suspicious financial activities, including money laundering through shell companies and ghost accounts. The documents showed that large financial transactions were being conducted through accounts that didn't align with his legitimate business. It all seemed like a well-orchestrated money laundering scheme. These findings led the police to believe that Sebastian might have been involved in something much more serious than family problems or an affair with the housekeeper. However, what really caught the investigators' attention was Alistair Trenton, Sebastian's business partner. Alistair had always been in the public eye, actively representing the Lane Company at events and within business circles. When Sebastian disappeared, Alistair seemed notably nervous, leading investigators to focus on him. Alistair immediately agreed to an interview, assuring them that he had no knowledge of Sebastian's whereabouts and that they had maintained a normal working relationship. However, his statement seemed tense and contradictory. He frequently stumbled over details of their last meetings and mentioned tense negotiations, but refused to provide further details. This raised suspicions about whether Alistair was hiding something, prompting detectives to investigate his relationship with Sebastian. As they delved deeper, they discovered that Sebastian's business might have been much less legitimate than it appeared on the surface. Some of his contacts were linked to criminal elements, including organized crime groups that used Lane's company to funnel dirty money through seemingly legitimate structures. They found contracts and agreements with foreign companies operating anonymously, causing serious concerns among the investigators. Additionally, several former employees confirmed that Sebastian and Alistair often did business behind closed doors, holding meetings without witnesses, and avoiding discussions of their finances with third parties. These individuals hinted that Sebastian might have been trying to extricate himself from a shady business but didn't know how to do so safely. Alistair tried to avoid revealing his involvement in these questionable dealings, but his nervousness and hesitation during questioning only increased suspicions. The police began developing the theory that Alistair Trenton might have been involved in Sebastian's disappearance, especially if Sebastian had started threatening to expose their illegal activities. They speculated that Trenton might have used Sebastian's disappearance to remove a problematic witness or a business partner who no longer wanted to participate in the criminal operations. However, it wasn't that simple. Despite their suspicions, the police didn't have direct evidence linking Alistair to Sebastian's disappearance. During this time, Sebastian's wife, Eleonora, found herself under increasing pressure as she accepted that her husband was not the man she had believed him to be. However, she also began noticing something strange in Alistair's behavior when he visited her home after Sebastian's disappearance, which only intensified her suspicions. Meanwhile, the police continued exploring other leads, suspecting that Sebastian's criminal connections might have led to his disappearance. All this information shifted the focus from Sebastian's personal life and the possible romance with the housekeeper Leisha. However, the investigation increasingly pointed to the idea that both family conflicts and criminal schemes might be linked to his disappearance, creating a more complex and tangled web of events. The police kept digging, examining all aspects of Sebastian's life, from his personal relationships to the criminal elements he might have been involved with. But the true identity of who was behind his disappearance remained an unsolved mystery. As the investigators delved into Sebastian Lane's life, they stumbled upon something unexpected when reviewing deleted messages on his phone. The detectives found a series of texts and photos hinting at a long romantic relationship between Sebastian and the housekeeper, Leisha Harper. This discovery changed the course of the investigation, leading the police to focus not only on Sebastian's criminal connections, but also on his personal relationships, which could have played a key role in his disappearance. At first, Eleonora Breton seemed deeply affected by her husband's disappearance, cooperating with the police and playing the role of a concerned wife. However, when the detectives cautiously revealed the information about Sebastian's affair, her reaction was not what they expected. Instead of an emotional outburst or a nervous breakdown, Eleonora took the news with coldness, almost as if she had been expecting it, or as if she already knew about her husband's infidelity. This reaction raised questions among both the police and onlookers, who wondered whether Eleonora was truly a victim, as she had initially seemed, or whether she had known about the affair and kept it secret. The police pressed her for more information, hoping to provoke an emotional response. However, Eleonora remained calm. When the detectives mentioned the possible connection between Sebastian's disappearance and his affair, she simply remarked that it was his choice and that there was nothing she could do if that was how he chose to live. Her calmness seemed suspicious, leading investigators to wonder if she had known about the affair much earlier than they had suspected. Her behavior began to attract the attention of investigators. The detectives began to develop a new theory. Perhaps Eleonora and Sebastian's marriage had fallen apart long ago, and they were only maintaining the illusion of a happy family. The text messages found on Sebastian's phone revealed that he had been discussing with Leisha the possibility of leaving Eleonora and starting a new life. This correspondence had been ongoing for months before his disappearance, and in the final weeks their conversations had become more direct. Sebastian promised Leisha that soon everything would be resolved and that they could be together. This aspect of the case led the police to consider the possibility that Eleonora knew about her husband's plans. Additionally, the records revealed information indicating that Sebastian intended to sell one of the family properties and transfer the money to an account he controlled personally, which was not linked to their joint assets. This raised suspicions that Sebastian had been preparing for a divorce that would leave Eleonora with nothing. Eleonora clearly knew more than she was letting on. She mentioned that her relationship with Sebastian had become more tense in recent months, but she refused to go into detail. The police began to consider the possibility that her calm demeanor was because, for a long time, she had suspected or even known about her husband's affair, and was perhaps planning her own moves. This revelation cast doubt on her innocence. Perhaps Eleonora was not the helpless victim she appeared to be at first glance. As new details emerged, close family friends mentioned that Eleonora had recently met with a lawyer, suggesting that she was preparing for a separation. Some friends also noted that she had become increasingly distant and cold toward Sebastian in the months leading up to his disappearance. This fueled suspicions that she was aware of the affair and was laying the groundwork for her own plans. The police continued their investigation, wondering if Eleonora knew about the affair and if in some way her actions had accelerated Sebastian's disappearance. The idea that her actions after the disappearance might be part of a more complex scheme left onlookers wondering if Eleonora was merely a victim or a potential player in this dangerous game. At this point, the investigation into Sebastian Lane's disappearance had taken on a completely new tone. Upon carefully examining his financial activities, the detectives made an unexpected discovery. Behind the facade of a successful businessman lay a dark web of financial schemes that turned out to be a key element in understanding his disappearance, adding yet another motive to an already complicated story. The first suspicion arose when the police began scrutinizing Sebastian's banking transactions. At first, their attention focused on regular transfers of large sums to accounts overseas. Financial experts brought in to assist with the case uncovered strange links between these foreign accounts and companies with questionable reputations, operating in a gray area of money laundering and fake contracts with criminal elements. The more the police delved into the financial records, the clearer it became that Sebastian Lane had been leading a double life, not only in his personal relationships, but also in his business dealings. One of the most intriguing findings was that part of these schemes was directly linked to Sebastian's partner, Alistair Trenton. Although Alistair seemed like a respectable businessman, the evidence pointed to his involvement in the same suspicious dealings as Sebastian, adding yet another layer of intrigue to the case. After examining the transactions from the months before the disappearance, the police discovered that Sebastian had been trying to cover his tracks and had begun transferring money to personal accounts. Hidden from official records, Sebastian managed these accounts in secret, without informing either his wife, Eleonora, or his business partners. Around the same time, large transactions were made to unknown individuals who then cashed out the money in other countries. Adding to this intrigue was the discovery that shortly before his disappearance, Sebastian had suddenly changed his will, leaving part of his assets to an unknown person. This caused confusion, as no one in his inner circle knew who this person was. However, a more detailed analysis suggested that it could have been an attempt to hide money and assets for future use. Secret electronic communication records showed that Sebastian had been discussing future plans with one of his criminal contacts. These conversations revolved around preparations for a backup plan, which only confirmed the police's suspicions about his double life. In these messages, Sebastian spoke of the need to hide a large sum of money and disappear for a few years until things calmed down. These conversations lent weight to the theory that he had been forced to go into hiding to save himself. The family, of course, was in shock after these revelations. Eleonora, who previously seemed calm, was deeply shaken upon learning the extent of Sebastian's hidden finances and fraudulent activities. She claimed to have known nothing about his crimes, though the police were increasingly skeptical about her sincerity. Some of the financial transfers were linked to their joint accounts, raising suspicions, The police also contacted international law enforcement agencies to trace the money transferred to foreign accounts and try to determine where Sebastian might be hiding, if he had indeed chosen to flee. However, the investigation results were contradictory. This new information plunged the case into even deeper uncertainty. Sebastian's financial schemes could have provided a motive for many. The list of suspects grew, including his business partners, criminal elements he might have betrayed, and even his own wife, who may have known about his shady dealings for some time. The discovery of Sebastian Lane's body marked a significant turning point in a case that had been in limbo for weeks. On a chilly autumn day, about 20 miles from the city, a hiker on a remote trail stumbled upon something that caught his attention in a clearing covered with leaves. There lay a body. Sebastian's detectives quickly arrived at the scene, cordoned off the area, and began their investigation. At first glance, it was clear that this was no accidental or chance death. Sebastian's body was in an advanced state of decomposition, but there were signs of struggle and clear evidence of a violent death. His body showed bruises, abrasions, and cuts that indicated a fight before his death. Forensic doctors determined that Sebastian had been killed by several blunt force blows to the head and neck, immediately ruling out any suicide theory. The body had been dumped in a location where it seemed someone had deliberately tried to conceal it. The area was rarely visited and far from heavily trafficked routes. It was obvious that the killer knew the terrain well enough to choose this remote spot, knowing that no one would find it by chance. However, it was unclear why this site had become a tragic meeting place. The detectives began reconstructing the events of Sebastian's last days, connecting his death to the suspicions that had been accumulating. His romance with the housekeeper Leisha, the financial fraud discovered, and the shady business dealings. All of this could have led to his death. Leisha, who had appeared nervous and withdrawn all along, became a central figure in the investigation after Sebastian's body was found. Her behavior grew even more suspicious. The police began to scrutinize her phone records and her interactions with Sebastian. She tried to downplay her involvement in his personal life, but the data revealed that their relationship was much deeper than she initially let on. Not only did they exchange romantic messages, but they also had numerous conversations about money that hinted at her involvement in Sebastian's financial plans, though she denied it. Even so, Sebastian's wife, Eleonora, unexpectedly revealed her true nature. Investigators discovered that her calm reaction to the affair had been part of a carefully crafted facade. Hidden recordings of conversations between her and Sebastian were found in her house, in which she directly threatened him. Upon hearing these tapes, the police began to realize that the couple's relationship was on the verge of collapse. Eleonora clearly knew about the affair, and this could have been the motive behind her involvement in a conspiracy. Her emotions following the discovery of Sebastian's body were too controlled for someone who had just learned of her husband's death. Meanwhile, Sebastian's business partner, Alistair Trenton, also came under intense scrutiny after the body was found. He began acting strangely, canceling meetings to leave town, and, in general, behaving in a way that raised more suspicion. Alistair had strong reasons to want Sebastian to disappear. The criminal schemes were falling apart, and Sebastian might have become a threat to the entire operation. The police conducted further investigations at the crime scene. Faint tire tracks were found near the body, along with traces of paint that could have come from a vehicle of that year. The clues made it clear that the killer was not acting alone. All signs pointed to the murder being premeditated. Every piece of evidence suggested that Sebastian had been the victim of those closest to him and his business partners. The discovery of the body was the climax of Sebastian's secret. His life, his romance with Leisha, his relationship with Eleonora, and his criminal connections all began to come together. The police now faced the task of connecting all these elements and proving who was responsible for the crime. An exhaustive investigation into the murder of Sebastian Lane led the police to an unexpected conclusion. The real culprit was his business partner, Alistair Trenton. However, it took the detectives sorting through a series of false and confusing clues, including family conflicts and Sebastian's romance with Leisha, to arrive at this truth. It all began when the detectives gained access to Sebastian's financial records. A thorough data analysis revealed that he was not only involved in questionable dealings, but that Alistair also played a significant role in these schemes. Both business partners were jointly running illegal financial operations through shell companies, mutually benefiting for a time. A few months before Sebastian's disappearance, things took a sharp turn. Sebastian began expressing concerns and doubts, suspecting that their operations could soon be exposed, and hinted at plans to distance himself from his criminal connections. Furthermore, Sebastian began threatening Alistair with exposure, putting Alistair in an extremely vulnerable position. If Sebastian had made the truth public, it would have meant not only financial losses, but also prison sentences for both of them. Sensing the imminent danger, Alistair began planning how to eliminate his business partner. He knew he had to act quickly and find the perfect moment. By then, rumors about Sebastian's affair with Leisha had started circulating among his close circle, but Alistair saw this as an opportunity to mislead the investigation. He knew that Sebastian's personal issues with his wife Eleonora could confuse the police and distract them from the real motive behind the murder. The planning was careful. Suspicious documents were found at Alistair's house, copies of financial reports with Sebastian's forged signatures. These documents directly linked Alistair to the fraud. Soon, more evidence emerged on Alistair's personal laptop, a series of emails with anonymous criminal contacts discussing contingency plans in case their operations were exposed. But the most incriminating evidence was found at the crime scene. Fragments of paint from Sebastian's vehicle matched Alistair's car, the same one he drove the night Sebastian disappeared. Detectives reconstructed the timeline of events and discovered that Alistair had lured Sebastian to a remote location under the pretext of an urgent meeting to discuss their business issues. During the meeting, Alistair attacked Sebastian and then disposed of his body. The investigation confirmed that Alistair's actions were not motivated by jealousy or personal feelings, but by the fear of being exposed. Sebastian's affair with Leisha and his strained relationship with Eleonora only complicated the real reason behind the financial fraud. Alistair counted on the police focusing on Sebastian's personal problems and family drama without probing further. The investigation reached its climax when Alistair was finally confronted and arrested. At first, he tried to deny his guilt, claiming that Sebastian had disappeared due to his personal problems, but the evidence was overwhelming during the interview. He confessed to the murder and admitted that there was no other way to eliminate his partner to protect his own future. Thus ended one of the most complex and intriguing chapters of the case. Sebastian's affair with Leisha, his tumultuous family life, and his financial plans were all intertwined in a complicated web that had kept the police from discovering the truth for so long. In the end, it was revealed that Sebastian's murder was motivated purely by fear of exposure, and Alistair Trenton had done what was necessary to protect his life and reputation. On a cold morning, when the court handed down its sentence, a somber silence filled the courtroom. Alistair Trenton was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The police had uncovered his fraudulent schemes and proved that he had killed Sebastian Lane out of fear of exposure. However, despite the triumph of justice, Sebastian's family, led by Eleonora Breton, was irreparably broken. Once strong and secure, Eleonora now found herself at the center of chaos. Her home, which had been a symbol of stability and success, had become an empty shell filled with pain and bitterness after Sebastian's murder. She had to sell nearly everything that reminded her of her former life: the house, the business, and even personal belongings that connected her to the past. Public opinion in her small community was divided. Some saw her as a victim who had lost her husband due to his affairs and criminal dealings, while others suspected she might have played some role in all this. Leisha Harper, the mysterious figure in this saga, managed to escape the spotlight. Her involvement with Sebastian in the matter that nearly led to a scandal remained unresolved. Though the police tried to interrogate her to determine whether she had knowledge of Sebastian's criminal activities, there was no direct evidence linking her to the schemes or the murder. As soon as the trial concluded, Leisha vanished as suddenly as she had entered the Lane family's life, evading serious punishment. Rumor had it that she had left the country to start a new life, without looking back at the ruins of the Lane family. Eleonora remained in the spotlight, but her behavior raised more questions after Sebastian's case was revealed. She did not show the intense emotion expected in such circumstances, leading to rumors that perhaps she had known about the affair with Leisha long before the police discovered the evidence. Additionally, some began to wonder if her role in the story was as innocent as it seemed. Some speculated that, upon discovering the affair, she had somehow manipulated the situation, or even indirectly pushed Sebastian into making dangerous decisions that ultimately led to his death. These questions were never fully answered. In the final days of the investigation, Both the police and the media began to suggest that there was more to the Lane family story than just love, betrayal, and business. Eleonora stopped giving interviews, avoiding the press and even her friends. It was as if she had disappeared into the shadows, allowing the public to draw its own conclusions. No one knew what she was really thinking or feeling. Those who knew her well noticed that she had changed. She had become more reserved and cautious, both in her words and actions. Helena Morton was born and raised in New Mexico. From a young age, she was known for her fervent devotion to the church and her unshakable faith. However, those closest to her knew that beneath her pious exterior lay a tormented soul, marked by a childhood full of abuse and neglect. Her father, Reverend Morton, was a strict preacher who ruled the household with an iron fist and a leather belt. Her mother, a submissive woman, closed her eyes to her husband's cruelty, finding solace in prescription pills and fermented fruit juice. From an early age, Helena learned to cope with this environment. At 18, she met James Calloway, a sturdy young man who had come to New Mexico from Texas to work as an apprentice at the local auto shop. James was everything her father was not: kind, gentle, and patient. They married within a year, much to the dismay of Reverend Morton, who saw James as a stranger unworthy of his daughter. James was a simple man with simple dreams. He worked hard, loved his wife, and only wanted to build a good life for his family. When Helena gave birth to their son Ethan, James's world was complete. He adored the boy, teaching him about cars and the value of honest work. Ethan Calloway grew up under his mother's intensity and his father's expectations. Quiet and introspective by nature, he often found himself caught between his mother's religious fervor and his father's practical approach. Entering adolescence, Ethan began to question the rigid faith instilled in him since childhood. The Calloway household was a study in contrasts. Helena's fanatical devotion clashed with James's more relaxed approach to religion. While Helena insisted on a strict adherence to biblical teachings, quoting scriptures over dinner, James preferred to demonstrate his faith through good deeds and an honest life. As Ethan grew older, the tension at home became palpable. Helena focused her attention more and more on her son, scrutinizing his every move and decision. She saw in him the purity and devotion she believed absent in her husband. James, for his part, grew increasingly concerned with Helena's intense relationship with Ethan, but he felt trapped between motherly love and religious upbringing. Unbeknownst to anyone, the seeds of tragedy had already been sown. The complex dynamics within the Calloway family, shaped by generations of trauma, misguided faith, and silence, were about to explode in a way that would leave all of New Mexico stunned. The stage was set for a drama of biblical proportions that would test the limits of faith, family, and morality. The roots of Helena's descent into madness and sin can be traced back to her tumultuous childhood. The scars left by her father's abuse and her mother's neglect were deep, and shaped her understanding of love, family, and faith in unsettling ways. As a child, Helena learned to dissociate from the pain of her father's beatings by immersing herself in the scriptures. She recited verses in her mind and found comfort in the words of the prophets and apostles. However, as she grew older, her interpretations of these sacred texts began to twist and distort, influenced by her trauma and desperate need for love and acceptance. Helena's obsession with the Bible intensified after Ethan's birth. To her, her son was a gift from God, a pure vessel, free from the sins of the world. As Ethan grew from a boy to a young man, Helena's attention on him became increasingly intense and disturbing. She began drawing parallels between her relationship with Ethan and stories from the Old Testament. In particular, the story of Lot and his daughters captivated her in a disturbing way. In her twisted logic, she interpreted such actions not as sin but as a divine duty to preserve her lineage. Convinced that in times of great need or higher purpose, even the most taboo acts could be justified by God, Helena delved deeper into her misinterpretations of the scriptures. Her obsession expanded to passages about the special bond between mothers and sons, which she twisted to justify her growing fixation, convincing herself that the love she felt for Ethan was the purest form of devotion, a reflection of God's love for humanity. When Ethan entered his teens, Helena's feelings toward him began to change from maternal to something much more sinister. She lingered as he stepped out of the shower, her eyes tracing the contours of his body, imagining herself running her fingers through his hair, not as a mother comforting a child, but as a lover caressing her beloved. At first she was horrified by these thoughts, spending hours on her knees praying for forgiveness, begging God to cleanse her mind of these impure desires. But as time passed, her prayers changed. Instead of asking to have these feelings taken away, she began asking for a sign that her love for Ethan was part of God's plan. In her desperation, Helena began to see signs everywhere. A sermon about Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac became, in her mind, proof that a father's love for his son could transcend conventional morality. A chance encounter with Ethan in a dimly lit hallway where their bodies briefly brushed as they passed was interpreted as divine approval. Helena's behavior became increasingly erratic. She insisted on homeschooling Ethan during his senior year of high school, claiming she needed to protect him from the corrupting influences of the outside world. In reality, she wanted him all to herself, away from the prying eyes of teachers and classmates who might notice the growing tension. James, absorbed in his work and trusting in his wife's devotion to their son, failed to see the warning signs. He attributed Helena's intensity to her religious fervor and her desire to ensure that Ethan grew up to be a good Christian. Over the following months, Helena's resolve began to weaken. Her touches lingered, her glances grew more heated, and her words took on a double meaning. Helena convinced herself that she was preparing Ethan for a great purpose, that their union would finally be blessed by God on a stifling summer night, as thunder rumbled in the distance and lightning lit up the sky. The line she crossed compelled her to act. She entered Ethan's room, her nightgown clinging to her sweat-drenched skin, and whispered words that would set off a chain of events that would destroy them all. "My son, my love, God has chosen us." The first encounter between Helena and Ethan was a whirlwind of confusion, desire, and shame. Ethan awoke from a restless sleep to his mother's presence, torn between his respect for her and the unsettling reality of her advances. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked in a voice barely more than a thick whisper, heavy with sleep and disbelief. Helena's response came in a low, fervent tone. "God has shown me the way, my sweet boy. We are chosen as in the old stories." Her trembling but determined hands reached for him in the darkness. What followed was a devastating shock for Ethan. His resistance crumbled under the weight of his mother's insistence and his own confused desires. Years of emotional manipulation and isolation had left him ill-equipped to resist her advances. In the heat of the moment, with thunder echoing outside and his mother's words reverberating in his ears, Ethan gave in. The consequences were a tidal wave of conflicting emotions. Overwhelmed by guilt and shame, he withdrew into himself, spending hours in the shower as if the scalding water could wash away the sin that clung to his skin. Helena, on the other hand, experienced a perverse sense of connection. In her twisted logic, their union was a divine consummation, a fulfillment of God's mysterious plan. In the days that followed, an uncomfortable tension settled over the Calloway household. James, unaware of the seismic shift in the family dynamics, only noticed that his wife seemed calmer than usual, while his son grew even more withdrawn. Ethan struggled to reconcile his actions with his beliefs, poring over his Bible in search of answers, trying to condemn anything that might make sense of what had happened. But the words that had once brought him comfort now seemed to mock him in every verse. A relentless reminder of their sin hovered. Helena sought out opportunities to be alone with Ethan. Her touch lingered, her words loaded with double meanings. She whispered scriptures in his ear, and her interpretations became more twisted with each passing day. "Remember Lot's daughters, my love. They did what was necessary to continue their lineage. We are no different." Gradually, Ethan's resistance eroded. The combination of his mother's persistence, his own confused desires, and isolation from the outside world broke down his defenses. What had begun as a shocking single encounter evolved into a full-blown affair. Their meetings were hurried and furtive, stolen moments in the dark corners of the house while James was at work. Each time Ethan swore it would be the last, he found himself caught again in his mother's web of devotion and his own internal conflicts. As the weeks turned to months, the affair intensified, and Helena's obsession grew. Her need for Ethan consumed her every waking moment. While James remained oblivious, she would slip into Ethan's room at night, even while her husband was home, trusting that James's deep sleep would hide her nocturnal visits. Ethan, for his part, oscillated between periods of self-loathing and a twisted acceptance of his new reality. There were moments when he almost believed his mother's ravings, when the line between divine will and madness blurred in his mind. However, these moments were always followed by crushing waves of guilt and shame. The strain of their secret began to show. Ethan's grades were already suffering, and the switch to homeschooling plummeted further. He lost weight, and dark circles appeared under his eyes from sleepless nights spent wrestling with his conscience. He often seemed to glow with a feverish energy, his eyes flashing with a jealous fire. They were nearly discovered once when James almost caught them in the laundry room, saved only by the timely slam of the dryer door. On another occasion, a neighbor saw Helena leaving Ethan's room in the early hours of the morning, which sparked whispered rumors that were quickly dismissed due to Helena's reputation as a devoted mother and Christian. As the affair continued, Helena's grip on reality loosened even more. She began speaking of running away together, of starting a new life where they could be together openly. She spoke of having a child with Ethan, of creating a new pure bloodline blessed by God. Too entangled to break free, Helena began contemplating desperate measures. She considered confessing to her father, her pastor, and even the police, but the fear of destroying her family with the ensuing scandal stayed her hand. Little did she know that fate, in its cruel wisdom, was about to force her decision. Judgment Day was approaching, and the fragile web of lies and forbidden desires that bound the Calloway family together was about to be ripped apart in the most violent and tragic way imaginable. James Calloway was not a man prone to flights of fancy or unfounded suspicions. He believed in people's goodness, in family strength, and in the power of honest work. But as the months passed, even his trusting nature could not ignore the subtle changes in the dynamics of his home. It began with small things, hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered a room, significant glances exchanged between Helena and Ethan at the dinner table, and the growing distance between him and his son. At first, James chalked up these changes to the natural growing pains of a family with a teenager transitioning to adulthood. But as time went on, the oddities became harder to ignore. James noticed Helena's sudden obsession with her appearance, the way she seemed to glow with a strange, feverish energy. He couldn't help but notice how her eyes followed Ethan's every movement, a hunger in her gaze that made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't fully articulate. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed to wither before James's eyes. The boy who had once been full of life and curiosity now moved around the house like a ghost, his eyes distant, his shoulders slumped, as if he were carrying an invisible weight. When James tried to engage him in conversation, Ethan's responses were monosyllabic at best, and his gaze never met his father's. There were other troubling signs as well. James began noticing Helena's clothing in odd places, her robe draped over a chair in Ethan's room, her slippers left outside his door in the early morning hours. Once he swore he'd heard muffled sounds coming from the laundry room, only to find it empty when he went to investigate. As his suspicions grew, James found himself wrestling with thoughts too terrible to put into words. He tried to rationalize the situation, searching for innocent explanations for the tension that had invaded their home. Perhaps Helena was simply being an overprotective mother, or maybe Ethan was struggling with the pressures of his studies. But in the quiet moments, when doubt crept in like a thief in the night, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. He tried to confront Helena about his concerns, but she brushed off his questions with practiced ease. "You're imagining things, darling," she would say, with a smile that never reached her eyes. But James remained unconvinced. He began paying closer attention, watching with greater scrutiny. He would come home from work at odd hours, hoping to catch sight of what he couldn't understand. The need to know what was happening in his family consumed him. As the weeks passed, James's world shrank, narrowing down to the single task of uncovering the mystery that had taken root in his home. Deep down, he knew something had to give. The tension was building like a storm on the horizon. James was determined to face it, to protect his family from whatever threat lay ahead. Little did he know that the truth, when it finally came to light, would shatter his world in ways he had never imagined. The stage was set for a confrontation that would end in blood and tears, forever altering the lives of the Calloway family and all of New Mexico. On the night of August 20th, a stifling summer evening heavy with humidity and unspoken tensions, the carefully constructed facade of the Calloway family finally shattered. The air was thick, laden with the promise of an approaching storm, mirroring the turmoil about to unfold within their home. James had been uneasy all day, sensing a persistent unease within him that told him something was wrong. He told Helena he'd be working late at the shop, a bitter lie on his tongue. Instead, he parked his truck a block away and walked home at dusk, his heart pounding with each step. As he approached the house, James noticed that the lights were off, save for a faint glow emanating from the second floor, from Ethan's room. Inside, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. With trembling hands, he slid his key into the lock, turning it as quietly as possible. The house was eerily quiet as James moved through the darkened rooms. He stopped at the foot of the stairs, straining to listen. That's when he heard muffled voices, barely audible, coming from Ethan's room. His son's low, anguished voice intermingled with Helena's fervent whispers. James climbed the creaking stairs, feeling his world tilt as he approached Ethan's room. The door was slightly ajar, and he could make out the hushed voices inside. The words he heard froze him to the bone. Unable to contain himself any longer, James burst into the room. The sight that greeted him surpassed his worst nightmares. His wife and son tangled together in bed, their naked forms bathed in the soft glow of a bedside lamp. For a moment, the three of them stood still, staring at each other in shock, and then all hell broke loose. James let out a primal howl of rage and betrayal. Helena leaped from the bed, her eyes wild with fear and fanaticism, while Ethan remained paralyzed with shame and terror. James's fury was palpable as he confronted them, his voice distorted by disbelief and anger. Helena, seemingly oblivious to her state of undress, approached James with her hands outstretched, pleading for him to understand that her actions were part of God's plan. James recoiled, disgusted and unable to comprehend her words. The situation quickly turned violent. James lunged at Helena, his hands wrapping around her throat. Ethan, snapping out of his stupor, jumped to defend his mother. The three of them wrestled in a chaotic tangle of limbs and raw emotions as lightning flashed outside. In the midst of the struggle, James inadvertently struck Ethan, who crashed against the nightstand. The lamp fell, plunging the room into darkness, save for the intermittent flashes of lightning. Amidst the thunder's rumble, a desperate explosion of violence unfolded in the dim light. James felt something hard and metallic pressed into his hand, Ethan's forgotten baseball bat. Without thinking, he swung it, connecting with something solid. A sickening crunch filled the air, followed by a heavy thud. The next flash of lightning illuminated a horrific scene. Helena's figure lay crumpled on the floor, blood pooling around her head. Ethan's anguished voice broke the silence as he confronted his father about what he had done. The reality of the situation crashed down on James, who staggered back, dropping the bat from his trembling hands. Helena lay motionless, her eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. In that moment, James realized that his life and his family's lives would never be the same. As if the heavens had opened, rain lashed against the windows. The storm that had threatened all night finally broke, mirroring the tempest of emotions ravaging the Calloway home. In a few brutal minutes, a family had been destroyed, a life had been taken, and a terrible secret had come to light. As Ethan wept over his mother's body, James remained frozen in shock. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The night of August 20th would go down in New Mexico's history as the beginning of a scandal that would shake the small town to its core. The aftermath of Helena Morton's death sent shockwaves through the quiet town. The arrival of police patrols, their lights casting alternating flashes of red and blue across the neighborhood, drew curious neighbors out despite the torrential rain. Whispers and speculation spread like wildfire. As they led James away in handcuffs, his face was a mask of shock and despair. Detective Ruby Hayland, an experienced investigator from the county sheriff's office, took over the case the moment she entered the Calloway home. She knew this was no ordinary domestic dispute gone wrong. The scene in Ethan's bedroom with tangled sheets, discarded clothing, and the blood-stained baseball bat told a story far darker than anyone could have imagined. As dawn broke over New Mexico, casting a pale light on the crime scene, the full horror of the situation began to unfold. Ethan, still in shock, was taken to the hospital for evaluation. His initial statement, given amid fits of hysterical crying, painted a picture so disturbing that even the most seasoned detectives were left shaken. The investigation moved quickly. Forensic teams combed through the Calloway home and uncovered evidence suggesting that the incestuous relationship between Helena and Ethan had lasted for months. Helena's journals, hidden in a locked drawer in her nightstand, provided a chilling insight into her descent into madness and religious fervor. When news of the scandal broke, the close-knit community of New Mexico was torn apart. Those who had known the Callaways for years struggled to reconcile the image of the perfect Christian family with the horrific reality. The First Baptist Church, where Helena had taught Sunday school, became a focal point for gossip and speculation. Pastor Virgil Clark, his face ashen and his voice trembling, addressed his congregation the following Sunday. "My friends," he began, "we are facing a tragedy that tests the limits of our faith and compassion." His sermon, a plea for understanding and forgiveness, fell on deaf ears for many. The shock was too fresh and the betrayal too deep. As the investigation continued, more details emerged. Interviews with family members, friends, and acquaintances revealed that there had been signs of trouble in the Callaway household for months. Neighbors recalled hearing arguments and noticed that Helena seemed overly possessive, even for a devout mother. Held in the county jail awaiting trial, James withdrew into a shell of silence. His initial shock gave way to an all-consuming guilt. He refused to see visitors, speaking only to his court-appointed attorney in monosyllabic responses. Ethan was released from the hospital after a week, becoming a virtual prisoner in his aunt's home on the outskirts of New Mexico. Traumatized and confused, he alternated between defending his mother's actions and expressing relief that the nightmare was over. Mental health professionals worked tirelessly to help him process the years of manipulation and abuse he had endured. As the weeks turned to months, the investigation began to quiet down. The detective on the case, her face lined with exhaustion, prepared to hand over the case to the district attorney. The evidence was overwhelming, the tragedy undeniable. Yet as she reviewed her notes one last time, she couldn't shake the feeling that there were no winners in this case, only victims whose lives had been forever altered by a toxic mix of misguided faith, unresolved traumas, and forbidden desires. The stage was set for a trial that would captivate the nation and force people to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of family, faith, and the darkness that can lurk even behind the most respectable facades. James Callaway's trial began on a chilly autumn morning, 6 months after the fateful night that had torn his family apart. The district attorney, Patrick Walsh, a man known for his sharp mind and even sharper tongue, presented the prosecution's case in meticulous detail, painting a picture of a man driven to violence by betrayal and shame, emphasizing the brutality of Helena's death. Crime scene photos appeared on a screen, provoking gasps from both the jury and the spectators. James's defense attorney, the young and ambitious Elizabeth Wesker, faced an uphill battle. Her strategy relied on portraying James as a victim, a man who had snapped under unimaginable circumstances. She brought in expert witnesses to testify on the psychological impact of discovering a spouse's infidelity. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Ethan took the stand. Visibly gaunt, he spoke in a monotone, his eyes fixed on the floor as he recounted years of manipulation and abuse at his mother's hands. His testimony was a double-edged sword. While it generated sympathy for James, it also underscored the violent nature of his response. The town of New Mexico found itself divided. Some residents, horrified by Helena's actions, saw James as a tragic figure who had been pushed beyond his limits. Others condemned him as a murderer, arguing that nothing could justify taking a life. The jury deliberated for 3 days, an eternity for those anxiously awaiting the verdict. When they finally returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. The jury stood to pronounce the verdict. On the charge of first-degree murder, the defendant, James Callaway, was found not guilty. After a pause, murmurs echoed through the room. On the charge of voluntary manslaughter, he was found guilty. The sentencing hearing, held 2 weeks later, was somber. The judge, with a grave expression, addressed James directly before delivering his decision. He expressed that the tragedy that had befallen his family was beyond measure, and that while the court recognized the extraordinary circumstances that had led to his actions, the taking of a life could not go unpunished. James was sentenced to 12 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 8 years. As James was led away, his eyes briefly met Ethan's. In that fleeting glance, a lifetime of love, pain, and regret passed between father and son. Then the doors closed and James disappeared from view.